Een goedemorgen allemaal en welkom bij inmiddels alweer de 4e lezing van de CIDI-informatiereeks Israël en het Midden-Oosten. De eerdere lezingen kunt u terugkijken op de verschillende CIDI-kanalen, op YouTube, op Facebook en de CIDI-website www.cidi.nl. Wilt u deze lezingen steunen? Dat kan ook via de website op cidi.nl. Daar kunt u verschillende manieren vinden om CIDI te steunen. Today we have a very special guest for today's lecture, Dr. Khalil Shikaki, founder and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Research. Dr. Shikaki is an opinion researcher, survey of polls in the Palestinian territories. And today he will tell us more. Hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I intend to speak about 4 issues in terms of Israel, in terms of how Palestinians view their relationship with the state of Israel. The first question that I'll address is one about the possibility of ending the conflict with Israel. Do Palestinians think it is possible to end the conflict? And if so, how? The second question I'm hoping to address is an understanding of what are the vital needs of the Palestinians. And if they are able to achieve their vital needs, what kind of compromises Palestinians are willing to make? And the third issue is about the role of diplomacy and violence in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. What is the role for each? And finally, how do the Palestinians see Israel, particularly in the last few years? Is it a partner for peace? Can it be trusted? What are the long-term aspirations of the state of Israel? These are going to be the issues that I'm hoping to be able to address. Before I do that, let me say that when I speak about attitudes of the Palestinians, I'm referring to surveys that the Center Iron have conducted, either separately among Palestinians. We've been doing surveys among Palestinians since 1993. For the last 28 years, we've been collecting data on what Palestinians think about a lot of issues, including, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian relations. And since 2000, these surveys have been conducted jointly with colleagues at various Israeli universities, from Tel Aviv to the Hebrew University, the Israeli Democracy Index, the Israeli Democracy Institute, I'm sorry, and so on. So these joint surveys have also asked Israelis and Palestinians identical questions in which we've attempted to see how the two sides see each other. Let me, from the outset, describe the 3 main conclusions that I will be trying to illustrate in my presentation. One is that the trend over the years, particularly over the last 15 years or so, has been negative. This is particularly true regarding trust on the other side, trusting the other side. The belief in the feasibility of peace and the two-state solution has been in decline, consistently in decline, at least since 2005. The willingness to compromise has also been going down. The second conclusion is that despite what I've just said, if given the right incentives, we find that the Palestinian public is willing to change, and that an effective leadership seems to be a key in making a difference. The third conclusion is that while public opinion is not a force for peace, it's not a force for peace because of the lack of willingness to trust the other side, nonetheless, my conclusion is going to be that public opinion is not an impediment to peace. This conclusion puts a lot of emphasis on the role of leaders, and obviously leaders at this point on both sides, leaders are not doing what they should be doing to facilitate this increasing the level of trust between the two sides, which, as I said, is essential for improved relationship. Also, before I get into the 4 items I described, I want to say that the last 4 years, which provide a lot of environment for a lot of the things that I'm about to say, these last 4 years have been, for the Palestinians, highly depressing, not for the Israelis, but for the Palestinians. Because in the eyes of the Palestinians, the Trump administration has essentially destroyed the Oslo framework, the agreement that was signed in 1993, without finding a replacement for it. A second thing that has been causing the depression among Palestinians is the belief that the Trump administration has also destroyed the notion of a two-state solution or the viability of the two-state solution. And the third is that those 4 years of Trump have also destroyed diplomacy based on international law, and has replaced it with diplomacy, with coercive diplomacy, one that is replaces international law and international norms and regulations by force and sanctions and coercion. Okay, so this is the environment, which is highly negative. Now let me try to address the questions that I have put forward initially. Is it possible to end the conflict, and if so, how? Today, most Palestinians are highly skeptical about ending the conflict. Most Palestinians believe Israel is not changing, is not interested in changing the status quo, and that diplomacy is not effective because Israel is stronger militarily, so it can do whatever it wants to do, and does not think that international law, Israel doesn't think that international law applies to its occupation of the Palestinian territories. This is one main reason why Palestinians tend to believe that the conflict is most likely will not be ending anytime soon. This, however, is not the way things have always been. There were times in the past, since Oslo, in which the Palestinians were, with a large majority, believed that conflict can end and will end at one point, and that the Israeli occupation will be replaced by a Palestinian state. That, as I said, is no longer the case. The best years when Palestinians thought it was possible to end the conflict and reach a peace agreement that leads to the creation of a Palestinian state, that was in the mid-90s and all the way up to 2005, even 2008. In 2008, we could still see significant optimism as the two leaders at that time, Mahmoud Abbas, the current president, and the former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, were negotiating. That's one reason why Palestinians in today do not believe that it's possible to end the conflict, but that this represents a major change in attitudes. Later on, I'll say more about why these attitudes have changed. The second factor that has contributed to this conclusion among Palestinians is the belief that the Israeli settlement construction throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem has destroyed and is currently destroying the option for a two-state solution. Now, when we first started to do surveys among Palestinians, the level of support for the two-state solution was extremely high. Almost 80%, 80% of the Palestinians supported resolving the conflict with Israel based on a two-state solution, the state of Palestine living side by side with the state of Israel in peace, security, and cooperation. This is one question that we have been asking the Palestinians since 1993. So 80%, 28 years ago. In 2008, this is the last year in which there was steady support. About 2/3 of the Palestinians were still supporting the two-state solution. Today, support for the two-state solution is less than 40. So a majority of the Palestinians is in fact no longer in favor of a two-state solution. So if those Palestinians who have abandoned the support for the two-state solution, what do they support? The main change has been in the level of support for a one-state solution that has started to gain momentum as support for the two-state solution began to decline. The idea of a one-state solution is advocated mostly by young Palestinians. Young Palestinians, in fact, support this idea more than they support the two-state solution. Even though among the public at large, support for the two-state solution remains a plurality. That is, the largest percentage support the two-state solution, followed by support for the one-state solution. Among the youth, it's the opposite. Support for the one-state solution is a plurality, but not a majority. And support for the two-state solution comes after the support for the one-state solution. The main reason that we see for the change in attitude regarding the two-state versus the one-state seems to be the perception of feasibility or viability. Is a two-state solution feasible? Those, even today, those who believe that the two-state solution remains feasible are likely to support it by more than 70%. So 70% of those who say that the two-state solution remains feasible, despite settlement expansion, despite negative trends that they see in Israel, they still think that it is feasible. If you are among those, then 7 out of 10 of you will support the two-state solution. But if you think that the two-state solution is no longer viable, then 3/4 of you will conclude that the two-state solution is not worthy of my support, and you will not support a two-state solution. There are other factors involved in support, but this issue of feasibility seems to be the most important. And this is also the most important in support for the one-state solution, the belief not in the feasibility per se, that is a negotiated outcome called a one-state solution with equal rights for Israeli Jews and Palestinians being achieved through diplomacy. That is not how young Palestinians in particular define feasibility. They think the reality on the ground is forcing both sides towards this conclusion. The reality on the ground is one that is making the two-state solution impossible. And as more and more people come to this conclusion, then this reality begins to influence attitudes, and both sides will come to the conclusion that they need to simply agree on the terms for this one-state solution. And that, at that point, the Palestinians will demand equal rights. Okay, so the trend has been negative, as I've just said. The one-state solution is gaining, the two-state solution is losing. How does this change? How is that affected by how Palestinians define their vital needs? How do the Palestinians define their vital needs? In their relationship with Israel, the Palestinians have come up with 5 vital needs. This is something, by the way, that we do in the joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys, in which we try to get from both sides a definition of their vital needs in a settlement that ends the conflict between the two sides. The following are the 5 vital needs for the Palestinians. Number one is always number one, that agreement ends the Israeli occupation, that there will be no more Israeli military presence in the Palestinian territories. This is vital need number one. Vital need number two is that once occupation is ended, it will be replaced by a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. The emphasis is on sovereignty of that state, that it is a real state, not a make-believe state, not a protectorate for Israel. The third vital need, as defined by the Palestinians, is that this state should be along the lines of 1967. So the land occupied in 1967, which is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, are to be the 3 components or 2 components of the Palestinian state. For Palestinians, East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. The fourth, I have outlined 3 vital needs. The fourth vital need is the demand or the need of the Palestinians to have East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, becoming their capital, the capital of the sovereign state of Palestine, which means also that the state of Palestine will have sovereignty over Muslim holy places in East Jerusalem. And finally, the consensus among the Palestinians in terms of defining their needs is that the agreement must acknowledge in principle the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So these are the top 5 most vital needs as defined by the Palestinians. So when we try to assess these vital needs, we are also trying to assess the extent to which Palestinians are also willing to compromise by exposing the Palestinians to the vital needs of the Israeli side. We try to assess the extent to which the Palestinians are willing to compromise. So over the years, we have found 5 areas in which Palestinians have shown willingness to compromise. Before I mention those, however, I should caution that the support for these compromises come only when we present the public with a package that contains all elements of the conflict and addresses the 5 vital needs of the Palestinians. As a package, they will support all the following compromises. But if you ask them about any single compromise taken separately out of the package without being an integral component of that package, we definitely do not see a majority accepting these concessions or compromises. So these compromises, therefore, should be seen as part of a larger package in which the vital needs of the Palestinians are met. So what are these compromises? Well, the Palestinians agree that once occupation ends, it must lead to peace, security, and cooperation and normal relations between the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. So the end of occupation is the means to build peaceful, cooperative relationship between the 2 states. The second compromise that we see is that while Palestinians are very much insisting on a sovereign state, they're not interested in having an army for that state. They are willing to have a state without an army or without major weapon system. That is, no tanks, no air force, no navy. The Palestinians are not interested in having any of that. Thirdly, I emphasized the importance of the 67 lines, right, for the Palestinians. But Palestinians say if this is agreed to in principle, we can agree to border adjustments, what is called territorial exchange or swaps. But as long as these swaps are limited, they are equal, you get area that is equivalent to the area that it would be annexed to Israel. And as long as these swaps do not affect the contiguity, the geographic continuity of the Palestinian state. The fourth compromise we see is that while Palestinians insist that their capital is East Jerusalem and that they should have sovereignty over Muslim and Christian holy places in the old city, they agree that West Jerusalem should be the capital for Israel, and that part of that could be all the settlements that Israel has built in East Jerusalem, and that Israel can have sovereignty over its own holy places, the Western Wall in particular, as part of that permanent agreement. The fifth compromise that we see is that I emphasize again one issue related to the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Somewhere between 5 to 6 million Palestinian refugees exist today. Does that mean, Israelis asked in our surveys, does that mean that Palestinians want all 5 to 6 million refugees to return to their homes and property inside Israel? The answer is no. We find that the Palestinians, as long as the principle is acknowledged, that is, the narrative is acknowledged, a majority of the Palestinians is willing to allow a small number to return to the state of Israel. Palestinians want the refugees to live in the Palestinian state, and refugees want to live in the Palestinian state. So a symbolic number, something like 100,000, for example, rather than millions, returning would satisfy Palestinian needs. So I've just described 5. I can go on and on with what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, but these are the vital these are all vital needs that I just described for Israelis, by the way. And so it seems there is room where both sides can have a dialogue. Is dialogue feasible? Is diplomacy feasible? Or do Palestinians think violence is the way to move forward? This is my third issue that I've said I want to talk about. Well, if we look at the trend over the last 28 years, we can find ups and downs. This has not been a steady change or stable condition. Today, there is no majority in favor of violence. The majority is opposed to violence today. But as I said, there has been significant fluctuations over the years. In the period, for example, between 1993, when the Oslo Agreement was signed, and 2000, just before the eruption, actually late 99, all the way, in fact, up until March, we find a majority of Palestinians clearly opposed to violence, the overwhelming majority opposed to violence. After the Israeli unilateral withdrawal from South Lebanon, and particularly after the failure of negotiations at Camp David in July 2000, and after the Sharon visit to Al-Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, in October or late September of that year, we started to see rising majorities in favor of violence. This continued to be the case all the way to 2004. Starting in 2005, we saw a major decline in support for violence. And since then, we really never had a steady or stable majority in favor of violence. We have seen changes and fluctuations, but the majority overall has remained opposed to violence. Does that mean that they support diplomacy? Not necessarily. We have seen that during most of the last 20 years, support for diplomacy has been very high. But starting with I would say, the failure in 2008 in the negotiations between Abbas and Olmert, and particularly after the second failure following them, the second failure of diplomacy after that came in 2014. If you recall, the negotiations that were sponsored by the Obama administration Secretary of State John Kerry at that time had a mission to try and convince the two sides to reach a peace agreement, and he failed. In 2014, this failure started to change attitudes regarding diplomacy, and by 2015, we started to see most Palestinians concluding that diplomacy isn't going to work. The last question I want to address is, what does this mean if diplomacy isn't going to work? Is Israel a partner for peace? Well, today, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians say no, Israel is not. But this has not always been the case. We have seen over the years ups and downs. There were times, particularly in the early period, that is from Oslo, I would say, all the way to 2008, when there was always hope, with few exceptions. There was always hope for the majority that there would be peace. Questions like, would this Palestinian leader and this Israeli leader, for example, in 2005, after the election of current Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, we asked the Palestinians if Ariel Sharon, who was then the Israeli Prime Minister, if Ariel Sharon and Abbas sat down to make peace, can they succeed in ending the conflict and reaching a peace agreement? And the majority said yes, Abbas and Sharon can make peace and will make peace. This was one of the most significant moments in where we saw a great deal of hope for diplomacy and negotiations, and for the belief that the Palestinians do have a partner in the state of Israel for a solution based on a two-state solution. The second element in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship that is negative is the question of trust. We've been documenting the decline in the level of trust on trusting both the leaders, the state, the leaders, and the individual members of the state. We asked about all of that, and today I can say that the level of trust is at its lowest that we have ever seen, as less than 20% of the Palestinians are willing to trust Israeli Jews today. What is driving this decline in trust? Well, for the most part, we find three reasons why trust is going down. Increased hardships. The more hardships there are, the less likely there would be trust. We conduct, and we continue to conduct, and today we are conducting surveys that try to assess the level of hardships that Palestinians go through every single day living under occupation, whether it's land confiscation or home demolition, preventing people from access to areas like East Jerusalem or holy places, or travel or checkpoints and so on. All of these things have costs, and the more you are exposed to these hardships, the more likely you will have less trust in Israel. And the second factor that seems to lead to rise in distrust is the exposure to violence. Are you exposed to violence either from the Israeli army or from Israeli settlers? The more exposed you are, the more likely you will distrust the other side. We also find impact for education. Those who are exposed to peace education, for example, are less likely to trust the other side than those who are not exposed to peace education. What are the expectations for the future? Israel is going to elections in March. What are the Palestinian expectations that these elections would produce a partner for peace? Well, clearly that is not the case. We find that most Palestinians believe that Israel moves in elections one after the other from one right-wing government to a more right-wing government, and that the trend in Israeli politics and society is for Israelis and for the government in Israel to become a coalition of more right-wing groups than center or center-left, who are perceived by the Palestinians to be more willing to talk and compromise. What does Israel want? Well, this is a question we've asked over almost all the years we've done surveys. And in the current surveys, an overwhelming majority believes that what Israel wants is to annex the Palestinian territories. Of course, this has been helped recently by statements from the Israeli Prime Minister and the Likud party in Israel and all other right-wing Israeli groups, even including those in the center, who have indicated that they would be willing to support annexation of Palestinian territories. Palestinians think that Israel is not going to stop at annexation, but that it will also deny those Palestinians who will live in these areas that are annexed equal rights, and would in fact try to create conditions that would eventually lead those Palestinians to leave their land or to be subject to expulsion. This is definitely one of the scariest of all perceptions that we see among Palestinians. When looking at the long-term aspirations, if Israel could do whatever it wants to do, this overwhelming majority seems to think Israel would want to annex their land and expel them. Is there, I indicated earlier that with the right incentives, we see significant change in positive change in attitude. We've been testing this since 2016. For the last 5 years, we've tested various incentives that have tried to convince Palestinians and Israeli Jews to see if they would be willing to change their hardline views and replace them by willingness to compromise. We have found that there is strong positive reception of such incentives, that these incentives, whether it's incentives about their own leaders, it's not just incentives about what the other side would be willing to agree to or concede, but also about their own leadership and also about their own political system. Changes, for example, to a more democratic political system is a very strong motivation for young Palestinians to support a two-state solution rather than a one-state solution, and so on. So I want to end with this, with the emphasis that the change, negative change that we are currently seeing is not a permanent and solid change, that there seems to be significant room for maneuver where attitudes can change. And clearly one of those factors that can help change attitudes relate to the role of leadership, their own leadership, and the leadership on the other side. I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Shikaki. As Dr. Shikaki said, we are now starting with the question and answer part of this lecture. So if you are watching on Zoom, you can post your questions. At the bottom, you see a Q&A button where you can type your questions. If you're watching on Facebook, I will try to monitor any questions there as well. You can post them in the comment section there. We already have a number of questions, some regarding the 2008 negotiations between Olmert and Abbas you mentioned. People are asking, why did these negotiations not live up to expectations? Why did they not achieve the result of a solution?
A very good question. Based on our surveys, they should have, because our surveys were conducted among Palestinians and Israelis alike. And we found at that time a majority of Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians in support for the same exact compromises that Abbas and Olmert were negotiating at that time. I must in fact say that we did a series of surveys in 2008 just for Abbas and Olmert at the request of both sides, the leaders on both sides asked for surveys that would try to measure the extent to which the two sides would be willing to accept the compromises that they were negotiating. And we did find support that, in fact, reached the level of 60% or so from both sides in favor of the compromises. Now, why did they fail? Well, I can only speculate. I don't have hard evidence as to why. My speculation is basically based on hindsight, with what we know happened after that, based on the statements that we also heard from both Abbas and Olmert. And in both cases, and from the Americans, by the way, at that time it was the Bush administration, and Condoleezza Rice was the Secretary of State that was following up with both sides and have in fact prepared a summary of what the two sides have done. And the Bush administration was preparing, in fact, to bring the two sides to Washington to try and offer them compromises that would have represented bridging proposals for those areas where the two sides were still not willing to compromise. And these efforts did not succeed not because anyone was opposed to them. Both Olmert and Abbas, in fact, were in favor of that. But the developments within Kadima was the political party that Olmert led. And Olmert, during this period, came under accusations of corruption. And although he wasn't indicted at that time by the Israeli by those investigating the crimes, the police, although he wasn't indicted and didn't go to court yet, but his party decided to replace him with Livni. Livni became the leader and the prime minister at that time for a short period of time. And the negotiations stopped at that time, and Washington didn't go ahead with the plan to invite the two sides to Washington, D.C. So I don't think Abbas or Olmert hindered reaching an agreement. I think both sides wanted to reach an agreement, but there were still few important issues that they have failed to address. And this failure, they really just didn't have enough time to be able to overcome it or allow or give the Americans the opportunity to try and do so. I think 2008 was a golden opportunity to reach an agreement, a very, very important missed opportunity at that time. But I'm definitely not going to blame one side or the other for that failure.
We have a number of questions asking, do you perform your surveys? Do your surveys include the Gaza Strip? And also, what do you consider the role of Hamas in the perspective vis-a-vis Israel and also in the peace process?
Our surveys are conducted in the West Bank, as I indicated earlier, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. We have always included a representative sample of the population in all these areas. So this is a large sample. We usually ask 1,200 people, and the sample includes all ages and equal gender and various levels of education that are consistent with what we see in the Palestinian census data. Hamas, of course, has been in control of Gaza, but before Hamas controlled Gaza, Hamas was a major political player in Palestinian politics. Its role in the peace process has been very negative. Hamas, after the signing of Oslo, have played the role of the spoiler, trying to prevent progress in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations by resorting to violence. This violence that Hamas carried out after the Oslo peace agreement started had devastating consequences for for those on both sides who were negotiating peace, as it weakened them and made them exposed to criticism from hardliners. And although Hamas has changed somewhat over the years and is much more willing today than in the past to agree to nonviolent means, it hasn't come around to share the view that the two-state solution is an acceptable solution to the conflict. So although Hamas today negotiates with Israel and Israel negotiates with Hamas, and Israel facilitates the transfer of funds from Qatar to Hamas in Gaza, there's still a lot that Hamas can do to become a positive force for peace. At this point, it is clearly not such a positive force.
That leads us to the next question. How much trust is there among the Palestinians towards their governments, both in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority and in the Gaza Strip with Hamas?
In both Gaza and the West Bank, we see no trust in the government. In our last survey, for example, 2/3 of the Palestinian public said President Abbas must resign. When we asked about trusting government, direct question about trusting government, those interested can see a lot of surveys that we've conducted about trusting government in the various rounds of the Arab Barometer, arabbarometer.org. You can see all 5 rounds that included Palestine. You'll find that less than 1/3 of the Palestinian public is willing to trust its government. The reason for that are several, but 2 are the most important. One is the fact that there hasn't been any elections since 2006, any public elections, general elections for a parliament and a president. So for most Palestinians, without electoral legitimacy, the government and the president are seen as illegitimate because they've lost their electoral legitimacy. And the second has to do with the perception of performance. That is, most Palestinians believe that there is significant corruption in the Palestinian Authority, that is not doing enough about corruption, that is not doing enough to improve living conditions, that the political system is becoming more and more authoritarian, that the executive is controlling the judiciary, that there is no free press, that civil society is being weakened, and so on. So for all these reasons, and many others, we clearly see little trust today between Palestinian leaders and the Palestinian public.
Okay, and what about the prospect of the coming elections that have been announced, both for, I believe, both president, the Legislative Council, and Parliament? Have you done any survey yet with regard to these, the announcement of these Palestinian elections?
This is not the first time that there has been talk about elections. This is the first time that a presidential decree has been issued calling for elections and setting a date. So on 22nd of May, we are expected to have parliamentary elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council. These elections at this point are not certain because there are still various problems that have not yet been addressed, particularly those related to the current separation between the West Bank and Gaza. Hamas continues to control Gaza, and Abbas and Fatah, his political party, continue to control the West Bank. And there are various issues when you hold elections where you need one government. You can't have 2 authorities in 2 separate places. it is still feasible. The various factions are expected to meet in Cairo soon to discuss these issues. Our center, in fact, yesterday issued a policy brief in which we have outlined these impediments to holding elections. If the negotiators in Cairo succeed in addressing these, we have proposed various solutions to them. If they succeed, then there will be elections. So what happens if elections are held? Again, I'm not saying they will be held. In fact, I'm very skeptical. Today, I'm skeptical about holding them. I hope I won't be a week from now, but right now, I'm not sure elections will take place. If elections do take place, however, what is the likely map that might emerge? Who is likely to gain more support from the public? At this point, Hamas, again, first, let me say something about the electoral system that we are going to be adopting. It is going to be identical to the one used in Israel, which is proportional representation. We're not going to have a majority system. We're going to have, based on districts, we're going to have one district, which is the entire area of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, one single electoral district, and people will be voting for political parties, not individuals. I'm now talking about the parliament, and the number of seats will be divided between the factions based on the percentage of popular vote they receive. So this is a new development. Based on this change in our electoral system, it becomes much easier to predict the outcome of elections. Not very precisely, this is too early for us to be able to do that. But clearly, we can't see Hamas in this case winning a majority of the popular vote. Our surveys show that Hamas can win up to 1/3 of the popular vote. The second, and in this case, Hamas would be the second largest faction in the parliament. The largest faction in the parliament would be Fatah, with, in our last survey, 38% of the popular vote. So that's a little over the 1/3 that Hamas would get. Assuming Fatah remains unified, our survey shows that Fatah might not remain unified, and there might be a faction led by Marwan Barghouthi forming his own electoral list, another one led by Dahlan. Both Dahlan and Barghouthi are leaders of Fatah. If they form their own electoral lists, they will damage the ability of Fatah to win. Although Fatah can, after the elections, join forces with these two electoral lists and have a large, sizable, not a majority, but a plurality of the votes. Our surveys show there is about 15%, slightly less than that, that would go to third parties, mostly from the left. And there is still somewhere between 15 to 20% of the public who remain undecided. So the picture today is certainly not crystal clear yet, but it certainly rules out a possibility of repetition of what happened in 2006 when Hamas won the majority of the seats. In 2006, Hamas did not win the majority of the popular vote. It only won 44% of the popular vote, but with 44%, because the system was majority, not proportional representation, Hamas was in fact able to win almost 60% of the seats, slightly less than that.
Multiple people are asking about the Abraham Accords. Last year, multiple Arab countries normalized their relations with Israel. Do you think these Arab countries could make a case to to get an active role in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians? Or does that give any hope whatsoever?
I think the answer is yes, they can, but only if they are able to coordinate this with the Palestinians. So far, the Palestinian reaction to the normalization accords between Israel and the Arab countries, the Palestinian reaction has been extremely negative. Most Palestinians view this as betrayal of the Palestinians, and most Palestinians do not believe it will help improve the chances for peace. And that this abandonment of the Palestinian cause, perceived abandonment of the Palestinian cause by Arab countries, weakens the Palestinians and strengthens Israel's hand. They believe, again, I'm now talking about the prevailing perception of the Palestinian public, is that these agreements encourages Israel to become more hardline rather than the opposite, because Israel can have its own cake and eat it too. That it doesn't have to pay a price for making peace and normalize relations with Arab countries. That is the prevailing perception today. Attitudes are changing somewhat compared to where they were when these agreements were first agreed to, but there is still a great deal of resentment and anger and frustration prevailing among the Palestinian public. If and when things begin to change and we see the Palestinians once again talking to these Arab countries about how they can play a positive role in promoting peace, things might begin to change. But at this point, this is not something that one can see happening anytime soon.
A short question by someone in the audience. What exactly do you mean, what you mentioned during your lecture, with one-state solution?
The one-state solution is not something new. The last time that the British mandate wanted, when the British mandate wanted to leave before the United Nations finally adopted the two-state solution in 1947. In fact, the British proposed a form of one-state solution for the conflict. Most Palestinians who support the one-state solution believe that it is one in which there would be a single state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That this state would be open for Palestinians and Israeli Jews. They can all become citizens in that state as long as they have equal rights. One person, one vote. For young Palestinians in particular, this is an implementation of the South African model, where blacks and whites had equal rights to end the system of discrimination and apartheid in South Africa. This was the outcome of negotiations, although in our case, most Palestinians do not believe that a one-state solution will come out of negotiations. Palestinians who support the one-state solution realize fully that Israel is certainly opposed to a one-state solution, and so they realize it will not come as a result of negotiations. I indicated earlier that they think the dynamics of the reality on the ground will force things in that direction. But it is about equal rights. It is about one person, one vote.
That brings us to the following question. Last week we had Yossi Beilin, who has led negotiations for Israel during the 90s, and he's also one of the signees of the Geneva Initiative. And last week he made a plea for, I guess you could call it, a middle ground between a one-state solution and a two-state solution, namely a confederation. How do you see that option of a confederation?
A confederation is supported by a sizable minority of Palestinians. It is less than 40%, somewhere between 35 to 40% of Palestinians seem at this point to be in favor of a confederation However, although I'm not personally, I don't see a problem with the confederation. I think it might be helpful to resolve some issues between the two sides. Still, I want to remind those who are advocating a confederation that it requires an agreement on two states. So you need to agree on the terms of separation between the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. We are having a hard time getting to that outcome. Now, it's possible that knowing that ultimately this will then become a confederation might make it easier for the two sides to agree on these other issues that I described earlier, whether it's borders or settlements or Jerusalem or refugees and so on. Given the gap in the positions of the two sides right now regarding all these issues, I'm not certain that the confederation idea will have a great deal of success. I'm not saying that we should rule it out, but I think at this point, there doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm about it, on both sides, among Israeli Jews and among Palestinians.
Okay. You also mentioned during your lecture the right of return, that is one of the main issues and also a principle. Is it really that much a principle, or let's say only a part, maybe even just a symbolic part, returns? What should then happen to the other refugees? Should they integrate in the countries where they're staying, such as Lebanon and Syria, or can they return to the Palestinian territories that would be formed in a two-state solution, or should they go elsewhere, integrate into Europe and Canada, for example?
The negotiations over refugees over the years have produced various discussions and agreements and disagreements on two elements of the refugee problem. That basically we have the symbolic issue of the right of return, the principle of the right of return. This is not about implementation of the right of return. The implementation of basically what to do about the actual refugees is the second component. But the first component is about the narrative. Refugees believe that they have the right and that international law supports their right. And any agreement that denies that to them is likely to be rejected. So what would be an agreement that can work for the Palestinians? Well, if you go back to the 2000 announcement, December 2000 announcement by former President Clinton in what came to be known as the Clinton parameters, he actually has a solution to that issue of the symbolic issue, the narrative issue, the principle issue. Should in principle be a right of return for refugees. And that, the formulation that Clinton came up with, I think is something that would be acceptable to the Palestinians. And on the second side of things, which is the more pragmatic, more practical issues, are the questions that you have asked about, which is, what do we do? I mean, there are 5-6 million refugees. Many of them already live in Gaza and in the West Bank, and these people want to become part of the Palestinian state, and they want to remain in the Palestinian state. There are refugees in Lebanon and in Syria, and for the most part, these refugees in Lebanon and Syria want to live in the Palestinian state. We conducted surveys among those in Lebanon, but not those in Syria. But we think those in Syria too are likely to think in similar ways to those in Lebanon. And then there are those refugees who live in Jordan. We have done surveys among those who live in Jordan. Most of them want to stay in Jordan. Most of them, one reason why they are different than those who live in Lebanon and Syria is because they are Jordanian citizens, not just refugees. So they are Palestinian refugees who have become Jordanian citizens. And so for them, when we ask them, what would they do? If they have a right to return, where would they go? The majority said, nowhere, we want to stay here in Jordan. But some did select to go to the Palestinian state. A small percentage selected to go to Israel. So in the survey we have conducted, we found a very small minority that said they want to live in Israel. They want to go back to their homes and property. But the overwhelming majority said they want either to stay where they are, whether it's Gaza, West Bank, or Jordan, with some who wanted to live in the Palestinian state, and some of them, of course, as I said, wanting to live in Israel, but that was a small minority.
You mentioned the Palestinians have no trust in their governments. How does this relate to their belief in a negotiated two-state solution? If they do not trust their government, yet at the same time they hope that their government will negotiate a solution?
It's a very good question. Most Palestinians who support the two-state solution are willing to put this as their priority. If there is going to be an Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that can lead to a two-state solution, most of the supporters of the two-state solution are willing to turn a blind eye to this question of their government, its performance, its legitimacy. They would endorse that agreement, even if it is negotiated by a government they do not trust. Now, there are, of course, those who do not support the two-state solution and will not accept a solution that that a government they don't trust reach. It's a fundamental problem, and it basically says that the Palestinians need to go to elections, need to have a legitimate government, one that is elected by the public.
How is the role of Iran perceived? Because Iran supports certain Palestinian factions, especially in the Gaza Strip. But how do Palestinians perceive this role of Iran?
Iran has some advantages and some disadvantages. So the Palestinians have mixed feelings about Iran. On the one hand, Iran is a Shia state, and the clerics control the government. So this is a Shia ideology, and no Palestinians are Shiites. All Palestinians are Sunnites. And so the conflict, the historic conflict between Shiites and Sunnites does have an impact in the way that Palestinians relate to Iran. There is concern about this issue that prevents a large number of Palestinians from supporting Iran, despite the fact that Iran publicly makes clear announcements about support for the Palestinians. However, for some Palestinians who are willing to overlook the question of the sectarian divide, such as those who support Hamas, for example, we do find significant support for Iran among those. One turning point in the way that the Palestinians have looked at Iran came after the Arab Spring. The overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public at that time supported the rising masses against their governments, including in Syria. But then they saw that Iran was supporting Assad against his people, the Syrian people demanding freedom and so on. And as a result, perception of Iran and its regional role has received a major blow because of the way Iran dealt with the Arab Spring. It remains a major player in Palestinian politics because of what you indicated earlier about support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But it doesn't really play a lot of diplomatic role and does not have any actual physical presence in Palestinian territories. And so its impact, other than in Gaza, is really minor.
Okay. You also mentioned the checkpoints, the presence of the Israeli army, that's of course one of the key points of the Palestinian perspective. Do they take into consideration that Israel has, from the Israeli perspective, has an interest in having those checkpoints because they say this is to protect Israel and protect Israeli citizens? Do Palestinians take that perspective into consideration?
Yes, when there is heightened tension, they realize the army is deployed to protect Israelis during times of high tension. But the checkpoints are there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every week and every month since 2000, since the second Intifada started. And it is destructive to the free movement of the Palestinians. Every single Palestinian has to go through checkpoints during their daily life from one place to the other. These are not checkpoints between the state of Israel and the Palestinian territories. There are about 500 checkpoints inside the West Bank, not on the borders. Palestinians realize the state of Israel is a sovereign state that has checkpoints at its borders, but it's the checkpoints that are inside the West Bank. And Palestinians do not think these checkpoints are meant for security. They think they are meant for control and rather than security, and that Israel can do away with the overwhelming majority of those checkpoints without having any concern about security, because they don't see a threat to Israel's security. The level of peace and quiet that has been prevailing in the Palestinian territories for a long time has convinced Palestinians that these checkpoints have some other goal, and which is basically to make life difficult and miserable and force Palestinians perhaps to leave the country and so on. That's the prevailing perception of the Palestinian public.
You also mentioned President Trump, the last 4 years, which made the Palestinians more depressed, more skeptical, again, in perspective of achieving a solution. But now we have Joe Biden in the White House. Someone asked, what would you say to President Biden if he would call you?
Well, the first thing that the Biden administration needs to do if it wants to promote more stability in Israeli-Palestinian relations would be to undo the damage that was done by the Trump administration to Palestinian-Israeli relations. I've indicated some of those early on. The question of Oslo, when the Trump administration presents a plan about annexation and gives Israel the right to annex certain parts of the West Bank in violation of the Oslo Agreement, and the Israeli government made those plans and still says, even today, that it wants to annex these territories at one point in the future. That certainly is something that the Biden administration must undo. It must make it very clear that the U.S. does not support any departure from the Oslo terms, and that the U.S. will not tolerate any discussion of annexation in this environment. That's one thing. The second is to restore the credibility of international law as the arbiter in the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. There has to be some terms of reference. How do we resolve the conflict? Or do we leave it up to force to determine? In this case, there will be endless violence. If we want a diplomatic solution, we need terms of reference for that diplomatic solution. And for a long time, the international community and the US in particular have emphasized, but also Europe and the EU and certainly, that international law, international norms must prevail in finding a solution. The Trump administration has completely destroyed that. And there is a need to restore confidence and trust in international law as the means to end the conflict between the two sides. There are other things that the Biden administration can do to strengthen the ability of the Palestinian government to go to elections, to have better economic conditions, and so on. So encouraging elections, restoring the level of support for civil society that the U.S. government provided in the past are things that the Biden administration should be looking very carefully at. Restoring the mission, the PLO mission in Washington, D.C., reestablishing the consulate, the Consul General office in East Jerusalem, the U.S. Consul General office. Certainly, these are all things that the administration can do, and certainly the Biden administration should do their best to embrace them.
Dr. Shikaki, thank you very much for your lecture. Aan alle kijkers thuis, dank voor het meekijken. U kunt deze lezing en alle andere lezingen van de CIDI-informatiereeks terugkijken op de verschillende CIDI-kanalen, YouTube, Facebook en www.cidi.nl. Op de CIDI-website kunt u ook manieren vinden om CIDI te steunen. Komende week hebben we doctorandus Leurdijk. Hij zal spreken over de internationale context van het Israëlisch-Palestijnse conflict. Dus tot volgende week, woensdag om 10 uur. Nog een fijne dag allemaal.